The Unicoi County highlands of eastern Tennessee in the 1860s sat at the specific intersection of two climatic systems that made firewood management distinctly more complicated than in the drier or colder regions to the north and west. The humid, subtropical climate of the Tennessee Valley below, which pushed warm, moist air up the Appalachian drainage in every season, and the Appalachian mountain winter that converted that moisture into the ice storms and wet snow events that the East Tennessee highlands produced from December through March. The result was a climate where the annual precipitation exceeded 50 inches and was distributed through every month of the year. There was no dry season in Unicoi County, no period when the outdoor woodpile could be expected to cure without the risk of the summer humidity preventing evaporation and the summer rain events re-wetting what the warm air had partially dried. A cord of wood stacked outdoors in Unicoi County in June was a cord of wood providing a habitat for the mold and the fungus that the eastern Tennessee humidity encouraged. And by October that cord was at 30 to 40% moisture and beginning to show the dark staining of sapwood, fungus that indicated biological deterioration of the wood fibers, as well as the moisture problem. The mold problem was specific to the humid Appalachian climate in a way that the drier Midwest and Plains climates had not experienced. In Indiana, Wisconsin, and Dakota Territory, the wood's primary problem was freeze-thaw, moisture cycling, and surface ice bonding. In Tennessee, the primary problem was year-round biological moisture, the persistent high humidity that fed mold, fungus, and insect activity in any wood that was not properly dried and protected. Surface-stacked wood in Unicoi County was not merely wet in a winter sense. It was progressively deteriorating through the biological processes that the humidity enabled. A 2-year-old cord of improperly stored Unicoi County wood was significantly less energy-dense than a freshly cut cord, because the fungal activity had consumed some of the wood's cellulose content, and the moisture had reduced the available combustion energy. Martha Holder had been managing the farm on the South Fork of the Nolichucky River in Unicoi County since her husband Silas had left with the 1st Tennessee Cavalry Regiment in April of 1862. Silas had been captured at the Battle of Stones River in January of 1863 and had spent the remaining war years in the Union prisoner of war camp at Camp Douglas, Illinois, from which he had not returned until November of 1865. Martha was 46 years old when he left, and 49 when he came back, and in the 3.5 years between she had managed the mountain farm with her daughter Celia, who was 19 in 1862, and the irregular help of the neighboring farming families who were themselves in reduced circumstances from the war's impact on the Unicoi County community. The wood supply problem had presented itself in its specific Unicoi County form in the summer of 1862, the first summer without Silas. She had cut and split the June wood for the following winters, supply and stacked it in the open-sided woodshed that Silas had built against the cabin's east face in 1858. By September of 1862, the wood's cut faces were showing the dark grey-black discoloration of the Appalachian sapwood fungus, and by December the lower courses of the stack were at 35 to 40% moisture with visible fungal threads in the cracks between the pieces. The wood burned, but it required extended kindling effort and produced excessive smoke and relatively low heat per piece. She had noted in the household journal that Silas had asked her to keep, December 1862, the wood from the east shed is poor, wet, and black in the lower courses, burns with smoke and slow catching. The shed does not protect from the summer rains. She had spent the winter of 1862 to 63 burning the deteriorated wood and thinking about what to do differently. The solution she arrived at by March of 1863 was specific to the Unicoi County problem and different from any approach she had heard described in the community. She would store the splitwood below the cabin floor, in the 3-foot crawl space that the cabin's foundation had between the floor joists and the ground, and she would use the cabin's own warmth to create a passive airflow through the below floor space that would keep the stored wood dry. The airflow principle was one she had observed in the Nolichucky River Valley farm buildings since childhood. A warm space above a cool space created a natural pressure differential that drew cool air in at the lowest openings and pushed warm air out at the upper openings. The cabin in winter was warm. The below-floor crawl space was cool. The warm cabin air rose toward the ceiling, creating a slight negative pressure at the floor level that drew cool outside air up through the floor gaps and the foundation openings. This flow was gentle, barely detectable without a candle held near the floor, but continuous. And continuous airflow through the wood stack would carry away the evaporating moisture and prevent the stagnant humid air that the outdoor shed had allowed to settle on the wood and promote fungal growth. She had confirmed the airflow by the candle test in March of 1863, held a candle near the east foundation panel. The flame drew inward toward the panel, air moving from outside into the below-floor space, then presumably upward through the floor gaps toward the warm cabin interior. She measured the flow rate by timing a thread of smoke from the candle near the panel opening. The smoke moved at approximately 1 foot per second, which she estimated was sufficient to exchange the below-floor air volume approximately twice per hour in summer conditions. Twice per hour was enough air exchange to prevent the stagnant humidity that mold required. The modification to the below-floor space was minimal. She had Celia help her clear the south half of the crawl space of the debris that had accumulated since 1858, excavating a path wide enough to slide wood pieces along the floor from the east foundation panel to the stacking positions. She laid 3 split oak rails on the clay floor, the same elevator rail approach that several of the other below-floor storage accounts in the tradition had used to keep the bottom course of wood. Approximately 3 inches above the clay floor, where the capillary moisture from the ground was highest, she loaded the October 1863 wood supply into the below-floor space through the east foundation panel. Approximately 1 cord of split hickory and oak, the Unicoi County species that burned best, and that she had cut and split in September specifically for the below-floor storage experiment. She loaded the below-floor space in October of 1863 and measured the wood's moisture by the cut face test in December. 15 to 17%, no visible fungal staining on the cut faces. She measured the outdoor shed wood from the previous winter's remainder at the same time, 30 to 35%. Visible gray-black discoloration on the cut faces. The difference was as dramatic as she had expected from the winter's poor fire performance. The below-floor wood was dry, clean, and essentially mold-free. The outdoor shed wood was wet, stained, and partially deteriorated. She loaded the below-floor space in October of 1864 with the same 1-cord hickory and oak cutting, and by December of 1864 the same result, 15 to 17%, no fungal staining. By October of 1865, when Silas returned from Camp Douglas in November, the below-floor firewood storage was the standard winter preparation on the Holder farm. The September cutting went below the floor in October. The outdoor shed held the older supply as the secondary reserve, and the kitchen stove drew from the below-floor supply through the hatch she had cut in the kitchen floor in the spring of 1864. The hatch had been cut when she determined that the below-floor wood was performing better than the outdoor shed supply, and she wanted the convenience of the indoor access, the ability to open the kitchen floor and retrieve the day's firewood without going to the outdoor shed in the Unicoi County winter rain. The hatch was in the kitchen floor 2 feet from the east wall and 3 feet from the stove. When Silas came back in November of 1865 and walked into the kitchen, he did not see the hatch. It was fitted with the strap hinges countersunk into the cover surface and was flush with the surrounding floorboards. He had been walking over the kitchen floor for a week before she showed it to him. He had stood in the kitchen when she opened the hatch and said, "There is wood under the kitchen floor." She said, 3 years of it working well. He knelt and pressed the floorboards around the hatch edge, dry and firm, no moisture damage from 3 years of wood storage below. He descended the ladder and pressed the clay floor, dry and slightly warm from the cabin's heat above. He looked at the wood stacked on the split oak rails. Clean-cut faces, no fungal staining, lighter in hand than the outdoor shed wood. He said, "How does it stay dry without ventilation?" She said, "The cabin breathes it dry." He said, "The cabin," she said, "the warm air above the floor draws the cool air from below. The airflow carries the moisture out. The mold cannot grow in moving air. The cabin breathed the wood dry." This was the key phrase, and it stated the mechanism precisely. The cabin's thermal convection, warm interior drawing cool exterior air upward through the floor, had been the ventilation system that kept the below floor wood continuously free. The cabin was the dryer. The wood below the floor had been breathing the cabin's convective current for 3 winters, and the result was wood at 15 to 17% moisture and no fungal deterioration in a climate where outdoor storage produced 35% moisture and visible fungal staining within 1 summer. The Unicoi County Historical Society in Irwin, Tennessee, has the Martha Holder Household Journal, 2 volumes from 1862 through 1874, donated by her granddaughter, Mary Holder Presnell, in 1931. The December 1862 outdoor shed complaint is in Volume 1. The March 1863 below-floor planning entry and the candle test observation are in Volume 1. The October through December 1863 first-year below-floor entries are in Volume 1. The November 1865 Silas return and the key phrase, "The cabin breathed, the wood dry," are in Volume 2. The record is in Irwin. It is still there. The physics of the passive airflow that the cabin's thermal convection produced in the below-floor woodshed, which Martha had described as "the cabin breathes it dry," requires a precise account because the mechanism was specific to the warm cabin vertical ground configuration and would not have operated in the same way in a cold or unheated structure. The convective airflow principle. In any heated building, the warm air near the ceiling is less dense than the cooler air near the floor, and this density gradient produces a slow upward movement of air from the floor zone toward the ceiling zone. As the warm air moves upward and is replaced near the floor by cooler outside air entering through any available openings, the pressure at the floor level is slightly below the outdoor ambient pressure. This below ambient floor pressure draws outside air in through the foundation openings and the floor gap. The air that enters from below the floor moves through the crawl space at approximately floor level before rising through the floor gaps into the warm room above. In the Holder cabin, this convective airflow through the crawl space moved at approximately 1 foot per second based on the smoke thread test Martha had performed in March of 1863. 1 foot per second through the crawl space was not a strong flow. It was the barely perceptible draft of a naturally ventilated building, but it was continuous and it moved in the direction from the cool foundation openings toward the warm cabin interior, passing through the stacked wood in the crawl space along its path. The airflow through the wood stack carried the water vapor evaporating from the wood surface into the moving airstream and transported it upward through the floor gaps into the cabin interior and from there out through the cabin's normal air exchange with the outside. The critical factor was that this airflow was continuous. It did not depend on weather conditions or seasonal variations to operate. In summer, when the cabin's thermal difference from the cool ground was smaller, perhaps 30 degrees rather than the 60 degrees of a winter fire, the flow was slower but still present. In winter, when the fire was running and the thermal differential was large, the flow was faster. Year-round airflow through the below-floor wood stack was the result. The comparison with the outdoor shed. The outdoor shed had no continuous airflow because it had no thermal differential driving one. The outdoor shed was exposed to the outdoor air temperature, which was the same on the outside and inside of the shed's loose board walls. Any air movement in the outdoor shed was wind-driven and intermittent, useful when the wind was blowing and absent when the wind was calm. In the frequent calm periods of the Unicoi County summer, the still humid mornings when the dew point was close to the air temperature, the outdoor shed air was essentially stagnant, and the stagnant humid air in contact with the wood surface allowed the mold spores to germinate and the fungal mycelium to grow. The below-floor space, in the same still morning, had the continuous gentle flow of the cabin's convection drawing the humid air away from the wood surface and replacing it with slightly drier air from the foundation opening. The mold prevention was the consequence of this continuous air exchange. Mold requires a minimum water activity on the wood surface, approximately 70 to 75% relative humidity at the wood surface, to germinate and grow. The below-floor airflow kept the relative humidity at the wood surface consistently below this threshold by continuously replacing the saturated air immediately adjacent to the wood with the slightly drier air from the incoming foundation stream. The outdoor shed's stagnant air accumulated humidity from the wood surface evaporation until it reached the mold germination threshold and stayed there. The below-floor space's continuous airflow never allowed the humidity to accumulate to the germination threshold. This was the specific mechanism that the other below-floor firewood storage accounts had not identified because they had been addressing different climate problems. The Indiana woodshed addressed freeze-thaw cycling. The New York barn cellar addressed greenwood moisture. The Virginia hillside chamber addressed rainfall moisture. None of them had addressed the year-round biological moisture problem of a humid subtropical climate, and none of them had identified the cabin's own thermal convection as an active ventilation mechanism. The Unicoi County below-floor space was not merely protected from the outdoor weather, it was actively ventilated by the cabin's heat. The specific construction that Martha had made to enable the below-floor firewood storage, clearing the south half of the crawl space, laying the 3 split oak rails, cutting the kitchen hatch, and fitting the east foundation panel, as the loading access was simpler than many of the other below-floor modifications in the series, because the Unicoi County cabin's construction gave her most of what she needed without excavation. The cabin had been built by Silas in 1855 on a limestone block foundation that elevated the floor joists approximately 3 feet above the ground surface, more clearance than the standard Indiana or Red River Valley crawl space, because the eastern Tennessee mountain building tradition favored higher foundations to protect the wood floor joists from the ground moisture of the humid climate. The higher foundation meant that Martha did not need to excavate. The 3 feet of existing clearance was sufficient for wood stacking without any additional digging. The clearing of the south half of the crawl space had removed the accumulated debris, dried leaves, small limbs blown under the cabin, the remains of an old bird nest that had entered through the foundation. Panel openings over the 8 years since the cabin was built. The debris had partially blocked the airflow path through the crawl space, and had been providing a substrate for the insect activity that followed naturally from the humid climate. She had noted the clearing in the April 1863 journal entry. April 1863 cleared the south crawl space of 8 years of leaf litter and nest material. One afternoon, the airflow through the east panel is now noticeably stronger after clearing the blocked path opened. She had confirmed the clearing's effect on the airflow by repeating the candle test. After clearing, the smoke moved faster at the panel opening. The split oak rails were cut from the same hickory and oak timber she was splitting for the October wood supply. 3 poles approximately 3 inches in diameter and 14 feet long, laid parallel across the width of the south crawl space at 4-foot intervals. The rail placement was the same principle as every other below-floor rail system in the series, elevation above the clay floor to break the capillary moisture path. But in the Unicoi County cabin, the elevation was particularly important because the Appalachian mountain clay was extremely moisture-retentive, holding water in the capillary zone for weeks after a rain event. The hatch had been cut in the spring of 1864. 1 full winter after the first below-floor wood loading had proven the storage worked. She had waited a full winter before cutting the hatch because she wanted to confirm the performance before making the permanent floor modification. December 1863 had provided the confirmation: 15 to 17% moisture, no fungal staining. In March of 1864 she had cut the hatch. She had noted her rationale. March 1864, cutting the hatch today, the below floor would proved itself this winter, dry and clean when the shed wood was black and wet. We'll have the indoor access now that the result is confirmed. The hatch was flush with the floor and invisible when closed. For the same reason, Martha Caulfield's cave cabin entrance had been obscured with mountain laurel, and Cora Wiley's Indiana hatch had been fitted. Without exterior hardware, the below-floor resource was the primary supply, and making it obviously accessible from inside the kitchen made it obviously identifiable from outside the kitchen. A person entering the cabin could see the hatch if they knew to look for it. Without knowing, the countersunk hinges and the finger notch were indistinguishable from normal floor construction. Martha had not designed the concealment specifically. The hatch was simply fitted to be neat and flush, as any good joinery was, but the neatness produced the invisibility as a byproduct. And the invisibility was useful in the Civil War-era Unicoi County, where household resource security had a specific relevance. The Unicoi County Civil War context, which shaped every aspect of Martha's 3-year solo farm management from 1862 through 1865, is worth establishing because it explains both the urgency of the firewood management improvement and the specific pressures of household resource security that made the below floor spaces invisibility useful beyond its thermal function. Unicoi County in the Civil War was in the divided loyalties territory of eastern Tennessee, where the Unionist sentiment was stronger than in the western parts of the state. The military activity through the Nolichucky River Valley during 1863 and 1864 brought both Confederate and Union forces through the area at various times, and the foraging parties of both armies were recognized hazards to farm household stores. A visible surface woodpile on the Holder farm could be commandeered by any passing military unit that needed fuel. An invisible billow floor supply could not be seen and could not be taken without knowing it was there. She had noted this dimension in the November 1863 journal entry. After confirming the first month of billow floor storage performance, November 1863, the billow floor wood is dry and sound. Also, not visible from outside the cabin. Whatever passes through does not see it. This is additional to the drying benefit. She had identified the dual function in the same journal entry that first confirmed the thermal performance. Dry wood and invisible wood were both values, and the below floor space provided both simultaneously. The specific Civil War rarer context, which did not appear in any other below floor storage account in the series, was the additional dimension that the Unicoi County account brought to the broader pattern. Every other below floor storage account had been about protecting the wood from weather, freeze-thaw, rainfall, humidity, surface ice. The Holder account had this benefit, but added the Civil War era benefit of protecting the wood from foraging parties. The below floor space was the Civil War era Unicoi County version of the security function that Cora Wiley's Reconstruction era North Carolina account had addressed 20 years later. Both accounts had identified the visible resource as the vulnerable resource and the below floor space as the secure resource. Both had arrived at the same solution from different social contexts, in different southern states, in different post-war decades. The community context of Martha's Unicoi County neighborhood, which she documented in the journal's entries from the winter of 1863-64 onward, shows the specific transmission pattern that the Civil War disruption produced. The normal community pattern of the Unicoi County mountain farms was a church-centered information exchange and a neighborhood mutual labor system. Families helped each other with the large seasonal tasks in exchange for the same help returned. This system had been disrupted by the war. The men were absent, the labor was reduced, and the social gatherings were infrequent. Martha's first transmission of the below floor firewood method did not come at a community gathering but at the individual visit level. Sarah Webb, whose farm was adjacent to the Holder farm to the north, had come to borrow a butter churn in December of 1863 and had seen Martha open the kitchen hatch. Sarah had said, "That is where the wood is." Martha had said, "Yes." Sarah had said, "The wood in my shed is black and smoky this winter." Martha said, "Come in the spring and I will show you the foundation panel and the rails." They had spent an afternoon in April of 1864 looking at the below floor space construction and discussing the airflow principle. Sarah had converted her own cabin's crawl space before the October 1864 wood loading. She had reported to Martha in December of 1864 that the below floor wood was cleaner and drier than anything she had stored in the outdoor shed. The transmission had continued through the individual visit pattern through 1865 and 1866, with 3 additional Nolichucky Valley farms converting their crawl spaces before Silas returned in November of 1865. The Household Journal documented each transmission: the visitor who saw the hatch, the visit to see the construction, the October loading of the new installation, the December confirmation of the result. The pattern was the same each time. Visitor sees hatch, visitor visits construction, visitor builds, visitor confirms result. The Unicoi County Historical Society in Irwin, Tennessee, 2 volumes, 1862 through 1874, donated in 1931 by Mary Holder Presnell. The December 1862 Poorwood Complaint, the March and April 1863 Planning and Construction entries, the October and December 1863 first-year performance entries, the November 1865 Silas return and the key phrase, the 1864 and 1865 community transmission entries, the cabin breathed the wood dry. The record is in Irwin, it is still there. The 11-year record of the Martha Holder Household Journal, from the first entries of 1862 through the final entries of 1874, documents the below floor firewood storage from its first experimental year through its establishment as the standard firewood management of the Holder farm. The record shows the normalization pattern that all the mechanisms in this series eventually demonstrate. From the detailed problem analysis and construction documentation of the first year to the brief, seasonal loading entries of the subsequent years, the 1862 entries, the outdoor shed problem stated clearly, December 1862, wet, black, smoky, poor fire performance. The complaint that established the need, no solution yet proposed. The 1863 entries, the planning and the first year. March, the candle test, the airflow confirmation, the decision to use the below floor space. April, clearing the crawl space. October, loading the first cord. December, first cut test, 15 to 17%, no fungal staining. The 1864 entries, the second year, and the hatch installation. March, hatch cut, now that the first year has confirmed the method. October 2nd loading. December 2nd cut test, consistent with 1863. The 1865 entries, the third year, Silas's return in November. The key phrase, October, third loading. November, Silas's return, his examination of the below floor space, his question about ventilation, her explanation, and the key phrase, the cabin breathed the wood dry. The subsequent entries through 1874, annual October loading notes, annual December cut test entries, progressively briefer. By 1868, the entries read simply October, below floor loaded, one cord, hickory and oak, and December, below floor wood dry as usual. The below floor firewood was part of the farm's standard practice. The cabin was still breathing it dry. The journal was no longer documenting a discovery but confirming a known result. By 1874, the journal entries on the below floor firewood were 3 words: loaded, dry, usual. The mechanism had been completely normalized. The discovery of 1863 was the standard operation of 1874. The cabin had been breathing the wood dry for 11 years. The record said so. The Unicoi County Historical Society in Irwin has the record. It is still there. The specific thermal conditions that drove the below floor airflow and that distinguished the Unicoi County mechanism from the passive storage mechanisms in the other accounts varied seasonally in ways that Martha had documented in the journal's temperature notes. In winter, when the kitchen stove and the fireplace were running full output, the cabin interior temperature was approximately 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The below floor crawl space was at approximately 38 to 42 degrees, above the outdoor temperature of 22 to 30 degrees in a typical Unicoi County winter night. Because the cabin floor was conducting heat downward from the 55-degree cabin interior into the crawl space air, the thermal differential driving the airflow, the cabin at 55 degrees against the below floor, at 40 degrees against the outdoor air, entering the foundation panel at 25 degrees. The flow rate was at its seasonal maximum in winter. In summer, when no fire was burning and the cabin interior reached 70 to 75 degrees from the summer heat, the below floor space was at approximately 58 to 62 degrees, cooler than the interior because of the ground's thermal mass keeping the crawl space several degrees below the surface temperature. The outdoor summer air entering the foundation panel was at 70 to 80 degrees during the day and 50 to 60 degrees at night. The summer airflow was therefore weaker than the winter airflow and occasionally reversed direction on the hottest days when the outdoor temperature exceeded the cabin interior, drawing cabin interior air downward through the floor gaps rather than upward. She had noted the summer reversal in the July 1864 entry. July 1864, the below floor airflow reversed on the 3 hottest days of the week. The candle flame at the panel now blows outward rather than inward. The cabin interior is hotter than the outdoor air at night on the hot summer days. The reversal draws cabin air down through the floor rather than up. Is this a problem for the wood? She had observed correctly and asked the right question. The answer, which she arrived at by September, the reversal on the 3 hottest days, had not produced measurable fungal staining on the wood stored below. The 3 days of reversed airflow had been too brief to allow the humidity to accumulate to the mold germination level. The annual mold prevention was driven by the months of correct direction flow, the winter months, and the normal summer nights, not disrupted by the 3 days of reversal in the hottest July weather. She noted this conclusion in the September 1864 entry. September 1864. The July reversal did not affect the woodcut test on the below floor supply shows 14 to 16%, no staining. The 3 days of reverse flow were too brief to allow mold. The system works over the full year. She had done a partial year experiment unintentionally. The July reversal was a natural experiment that tested whether brief interruptions in the airflow direction were significant, and had found that they were not. The annual performance of the below floor ventilation was robust against brief reversals. The Silas return in November of 1865, and his examination of the below floor space after 3 years of its existence, provides the external confirmation of the mechanism that the other accounts in this series had, typically provided through a neighbor's first observation. Silas's perspective was unique because he had known the cabin intimately before the billow floor conversion and could compare the before state directly with the after state. He had remembered the outdoor shed wood from before the war, the annual December complaint about the wet, black, smoky wood that she had noted in the journal and that he had shared before he left. He had not known about the below floor conversion. She had not written to him about it, partly because the Camp Douglas mail was unreliable, and partly because describing a construction innovation in a Camp mail letter would have been difficult. He had come home to find the kitchen floor hatch that he had not known existed, and the below floor space that had been functioning for 3 winters. His examination had been thorough. He had descended the ladder, pressed the clay floor, dry and warm from the cabin heat above, pressed the wood on the rails dry, clean-cut faces, no staining, and pressed the floorboards from below, dry and structurally sound. No moisture damage from 3 years of storage below them. He had come back up and asked the ventilation question. She had explained the cabin's thermal convection driving the airflow through the floor gaps. He had said, "The cabin breathed the wood dry." She had not written that phrase first. He had said it. She had written it into the journal because it was accurate. He had named the mechanism in the same way that the other account's key phrases had named their mechanisms. The animal did it. The ground does not know about the Arctic. The wind never found it. The cabin breathed the wood dry. 4 words for the mechanism: the cabin, the breath, the wood, the dryness. The mechanism was the breathing. The cabin was the breather. The wood was what the breathing dried. The Unicoi County Historical Society in Irwin, Tennessee. 2 volumes, 1862 through 1874. Donated 1931 by Mary Holder Presnell. The November 1865 entry with Silas's return and examination and the key phrase: the below-floor wood was dry. The cabin had been breathing it dry for 3 winters. The record is in Irwin. The cabin breathed the wood dry. It always had. The comparison between the Martha Holder Belofla Woodshed and the other Belofla Firewood storage accounts in the series, Indiana, New York, North Carolina, Dakota Territory, reveals the specific feature that makes the Unicoi County account the only one in which the mechanism was primarily biological rather than physical. The Indiana Woodshed had addressed a physical problem, the freeze-thaw cycling that iced the surface wood and bonded adjacent pieces. The New York barn cellar had addressed a physical problem, green wood moisture that required active drying from animal body heat. The North Carolina below-floor space had addressed a social problem, the vulnerability of visible resources in the Reconstruction-era Piedmont. The Dakota Territory underground shed had addressed a physical problem, the blizzard moisture cycling on a flat exposed prairie. The Unicoi County Belofla space had addressed a biological problem, the mold and fungal growth that the humid subtropical climate promoted in any wood that was not continuously ventilated. This was a different category of threat from the other accounts. Physical moisture could be removed by drying. Biological moisture created progressive structural damage to the wood's cellulose fibers that was irreversible. The 15 to 17% moisture of properly stored Unicoi County Belofla wood was not merely drier than the outdoor shed wood. It was also structurally sound wood, wood that had not lost calorific density to fungal consumption of its cell wall material. The energy density difference between fungally deteriorated wood and sound wood was real and measurable in combustion performance. Fungally deteriorated wood at 15% moisture burned as efficiently as sound wood at 15% moisture in terms of combustion chemistry, but it produced less heat per unit weight because some of its cellulose had been converted to carbon dioxide and water by the fungal metabolism before it ever reached the stove. The December 1862 complaint, slow catching, smoky, poor heat per piece, had reflected this combined effect. The outdoor shed wood was both higher moisture and lower energy density. The below-floor space had addressed both simultaneously. The airflow had kept the moisture below the mold germination threshold, and the absence of mold had preserved the wood's structural integrity and its calorific content. The below-floor wood burned more cleanly, caught more readily, and produced more heat per piece than the outdoor shed wood, not just because it was drier, but because it had not been consumed by the fungal activity that the outdoor humidity had enabled. She had noted both dimensions of the performance improvement in the December 1863 cut test entry. December 1863, Below floor wood dry and sound. No black staining on the cut faces. Burns with clean catch and strong heat. The outdoor shed wood, the remainder from last winter, still shows the black discoloration on the cut faces and burns slowly and poorly. The billow floor wood is better in all respects. Drier, cleaner, hotter. The cabin breathes it better than the shed can. She had written the phrase in a different form here. The cabin breathes it better than the shed can before the November 1865 entry where Silas had said the cabin breathed it dry. Both formulations were in the journal. Both were correct. The specific below floor space mechanism, thermal convection driven by the cabin's heat, creating continuous airflow through the stored wood, was the most energetically elegant of any mechanism in the series, because it was entirely passive and entirely free. The Indiana woodshed had required drainage construction with a bored limestone hole. The hillside chamber had required flat stone ventilation channels. The barn cellar had required animals to generate body heat. The lava tube cave had required a stove. The below-floor woodshed, driven by the cabin's own thermal convection, required nothing. No construction, no installation, no fuel, no animals. The cabin was already warm. The warm cabin was already convecting air through the floor gaps. The below-floor space simply needed to be clear and to have the wood on rails. Everything else was provided by the cabin's normal operation. The wood stored below the cabin floor benefited from the cabin's heat without consuming any of that heat. The cabin's thermal convection was the byproduct of the stove's operation, not an additional energy expenditure. The convection occurred because the cabin was heated, not because additional heating was done for the wood's benefit. The wood was dried by the waste heat of the cabin's normal operation, the heat that would have been driving convection through the floor gaps regardless of whether the wood was below the floor or not. The below-floor space had captured a byproduct and made it useful. The cabin breathed the wood dry with the same breath it used to warm the room. The mechanism had no marginal fuel cost. It was entirely free. The Unicoi County Historical Society in Irwin, Tennessee. The record is complete. 2 volumes, 1862 through 1874. The problem stated in December 1862. The solution designed in March and April 1863. The construction completed in April and October of 1863. 11 winters of the billow floor space providing dry, sound, mold-free firewood to the Holder cabin on the South Fork of the Nolichucky River. The cabin breathed the wood dry. The mechanism was free. It always was.